Welcome to Authors Alcove for fantasy writers. This is episode 10 of the Story Savvy series, where Rebecca, the developmental editor and friend of mine, is with Heartbound Editing. She is helping me self-edit my good story into a great one. If you haven't already, I encourage you to like and subscribe to the podcast. You can also join the Authors Alcove community on Patreon or check out the new membership site at authorsalcove.com. Last week, we went over delivering payoff in the global climax and resolution of a story. Today, we're going to dive into refining better character arcs for your protagonist. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hello. I am very happy to be here as always, and I'm excited today to really focus on character over plot for the first time by itself and how to create strong character arcs for their characters through the story. And by the end of the episode, I'm hopeful that you will feel confident in identifying what sort of arc you want for your main character and how to make sure that it works well for your readers.
All right, so let's start off. I'm going to start off with, I think, which is a big question. What is the biggest blind spot or mistake that you see as an editor that writers have when creating their character arcs?
Mostly that they don't go deep enough, and this can appear in a couple of different ways. So one way that I see authors make this mistake is that they take that sort of concept of a character arc far too surface level. Like the change arc is in the protagonist's situation or title or the tools that they have, and not a change arc around who they are as a person or their mindset or worldview around the core issue of that story. The other way that I see this mistake come up is that the author creates the character as they want that protagonist to be right off the bat, and then face resistance as the author writing the story to give them a meaningful arc from that point. So to fix it from that perspective, I often end up giving feedback that the author can either start off their protagonist in a worse off position so that that place where they want the protagonist to be is the end goal and you have that change arc to get there, or simply push your imagination to see, all right, well, this is where I'm starting the character. How can I actually make it even better? How can I let them grow into more of who I want them to be over the span of that story?
So, how do we know if our main character has grown enough through their crisis for it to pay off in the climax, like we talked about in the last episode?
Yes, so we did go over that a little bit in episode 9. So if people are still wondering about that, I suggest you go back and listen to that again. There's a question that you can ask yourself here, which is, could the protagonist function the same way in the climax if they were dropped into it as their chapter one selves, which I talked about in the last episode. And then if the answer is no, they would not survive that. If the climax would go very differently because they hadn't been through that story yet, if they hadn't been pushed to change yet, then you probably have a meaningful arc change and you're fine. If the climax would largely go the same way, if that wouldn't make a huge difference to the story, or if they could, cope with it about as well as they do, having gone through the story as they would in chapter one, then you may have not, forced them to change enough or gone through enough of a journey for them.
So, how can I help my writer see that the growth in my protagonist is earned?
Yeah. So the last question and answer pretty much covers this, but again, I will add on to that. Um, what does the Dark Knight for your protagonist looks like? So if you're familiar with I think it's Campbell's theory of the heroic journey. Then the Dark Knight is this part usually in the early second half of a story where the character kind of has to reckon with the mistakes that they've been making or their flaws, and they have to do some introspection and come to their better selves through that process. So, what does your Dark Knight look like? What mistakes did your protagonist make? What bridges did they burn, or what wrong person did they trust in? to answer all of this, ideally, what led to their global crisis? And then from there, have they since owned up to that mistake or made amends or fixed their mindset around that thing, whatever is applicable to their situation and their arc? Um, and then from there, you can kind of gauge, depending on your answers there, if they've earned it, then they made a mistake and they made amends for it, or whatever that calculation is for you. So if they made a sacrifice in doing so, that can be another level of earning that. Um, and that sacrifice, the price of that sacrifice can be as little as, humility and shame, or hurting one's own pride as you have to make apologies, that sort of stuff. um, Cognitive dissonance can be used if you have really low stakes. But if it's higher stakes, it needs to actually be like, oh, I'm giving away a lot of my wealth, or I'm sacrificing my own safety, that sort of thing. If those different aspects are in the mix, then it's very likely that the reader will feel that the change was earned. The clearest example of this is in romance, where these elements are these sorry these ingredients in the formula are very much core conventions of the genre. The global crisis is the breakup between the lovers. Their character arc is to earn their happily ever after, and realizing that they were wrong to do that breakup or whatever came between them. And the climax example of their pivotal choice is to try to make things right with the other lover in the grand gesture or proof of love, which should contain some form of sacrifice, or basically just giving of oneself without expecting to get anything in return, so that it's selfless. Other genres are less picky about exactly what character arc is expected or how to earn it. But it's worth thinking about in regards to your comp books. So the books similar to yours that you're reading and studying, hopefully doing this throughout the process, or building up to it. And in looking at that, looking at how you can both nail a beloved trope within your genre, as well as trying to make it a little bit fresh and unique to your protagonist in your story.
So I know when I did my first round of edits, one thing that I realized is that my my main character's growth was a little bit too rushed. And
Mm.
so how can I make sure that my protagonist's growth isn't rushed or forced? And if we recognize it in our own writing that it does seem one of those things, what are tips to help us seem more organic?
So I'll start off by saying that this is a pretty common thing that I see with particularly newer authors, and it's something that practice will help make perfect. But in regards to sort of how you can adjust that, or if you know that it's an issue, how you can see where and and where you need to fix that, try asking yourself, in what moments in the story, or interactions between the protagonist and other characters, could you tweak or add little things in to explain a more gradual transition of that change? So, to break this process down a little bit further, I recommend that you start out by naming the starting point for that character arc, the lowest point that forces them to see how they need to change, like I just talked about with the Dark Knight, that is often the Dark Knight, and then the end point for that character arc that you are aiming to get them to by the end of the story, or by the climax, or wherever that needs to be really paid off, the pinnacle of it. So the next step after that would be to plan out a number of progressive escalations between those three markers. So between starting in middle, and between middle and end. Um, so that's either going to be progressively getting worse, or doubling down on the flaw, whatever that negative aspect of the character arc is. Ideally, that's the arc between the beginning and middle, or getting progressively better. So changing and learning to be their better selves, ideally between that midpoint or that Dark Knight and their ending point for their arc. I personally suggest a minimum of 3 connecting dots between those markers, But if you really want to go, whole hog with this, then you can try to find a little progressive moment in every single chapter. That's very much up to you, but I don't think that you should obsess on this to the point of getting overwhelmed. So 3 connecting dots between the major moments is a good starting point. So once you have those progressive escalations planned out, um, the the first point that I want to make in how you approach this is the point of building it is that they are progressive escalations so that you can do it in a natural sort of like step by step. If you think of it like a staircase, you walk up each step to get to the next landing rather than jumping. Some people do that, but for the purposes of the story, try to take it up one step at a time to get people, get your readers to follow this journey and make it feel natural and gradual in this buildup over time. The second point I want to make here is that it doesn't have to be a straight line in either direction. It doesn't have to be walking right up that staircase or walking right down it if it's a negative progression. The phrase 2 steps forward, 1 step back is ideal actually for maximum effect so that you can show that that it's very human, it's very natural to have some progress and then you have a setback or have some setbacks and a little bit of progress. So bearing that in mind is definitely gonna be helpful. The third point here is make sure that you are showing rewards or costs for each of these moments for the protagonist, these progressive moments in their arc. Um, it can be subtle. It can be so subtle in the small moments, but you do want it to be a little bit more noticeable or overt in the big moments. So this can get tricky and vary widely from book to book, but as a very general rule of thumb, if the protagonist makes a positive step on their arc, so in the direction that you want them to go towards that endpoint, then you want to reward them for it. And again, this can be anything like just a little bit of pride or, a little bit of extra resource or calmness or connection or whatever positive traits you can show that, oh, well, they chose to, going back to an example I learned used in an earlier episode, if they choose to call out their drunk uncle instead of staying quiet and sacrificing their agency in that moment, then they get rewarded by, let's say, a cousin just saying, "Oh, thank you so much for doing that. I hate having to deal with him, and I'm so glad someone called him out." That's a reward. So on the other side of that, when your protagonist makes a negative step, so doubling down on their flaw or choosing wrong rather than choosing right in a direction that would make them a better person, you want to punish them in some small way. Again, cognitive dissonance, shame, loss of an ally, whatever that happens to be, and fits for your story. But I do want to add the caveat that you can play with this. That's the rules, and this is a rule that I think can be broken very, very effectively if you want your protagonist to go down a darker path. If you want them to have a really dark double down on their worst traits before they get better, then rewarding them for those bad choices that's going to push them down that line, and that can be used really effectively and in really fun ways, as long as you're aware of it and you understand that the reader is going to subconsciously pick up on, oh, this behavior is being rewarded, and possibly misunderstand things around that if it's behavior that you don't actually want to be rewarded. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that like breaking that rule is better for like adult audiences rather than like my middle grade, where my middle grade really needs that like consequence because
Yes,
they're still learning the consequences of life. And so, yeah, I think that
great point.
that was that was very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So, I know this is something that I struggle with a little bit is what happens if a secondary character's arc or the villain's arc is stronger than the protagonist and overshadows the character arc of our main protagonist.
Yes, this was definitely something that we talked about a lot in the developmental edit that I did on your book. So happy to kind of share this with the audience at this point. As I've said before, your protagonist isn't going to come across as the protagonist if it's being overshadowed. So this will likely leave the readers feeling like the story is poorly written or like they don't like the protagonist, which can be a big problem for people just liking and connecting with the book. Or like they never really figured out what the story was actually trying to be about beneath the surface. So there are three basic solutions to this issue of a secondary character overshadowing the protagonist. The first is you can make your let me try this again. You can make your protagonists change arc stronger and deeper until it has gotten bigger and now overshadows that other secondary character one that you're concerned about. So that's option one. Option two is you can take that character arc that's so strong and so interesting away from that secondary character and instead put it onto your protagonist. So basically taking those actions and that internal journey and changing who in the story has those thoughts and does those actions and goes on that journey into your protagonist. And then option three is make that secondary character your protagonist. This can it can definitely be the most daunting option, especially if you're writing, a story where the POV matters and you generally want to be in your protagonist's POV. But it can absolutely be the difference between a story being mediocre and being a best-selling masterwork is that line can be deciding, oh, this character is actually the protagonist. I'm going to change the whole story around that to show that this is actually where the story is anchored.
I think that's definitely something that I had to think about when I'm writing mine because I had two main protagonists and I I know this sounds weird, but I actually prefer my secondary protagonist.
Okay.
And so he's going to have quite the story arc in the second book, but I still have to make sure that she still carries it in the first in both books as well, because I
Okay.
do want a female main protagonist.
Right.
So like that is actually been a struggle of mine. And maybe partly I think sometimes is I identify with men. I've always identified with men more and boys. And I had like all male cousins except for one female cousin. I have three brothers. So like to me, I always, and I growing up, I struggled with female friendships. And so for me, like I do identify a little bit more with the male, even though I am a female. So I think that's
I
also
actually identify with that so much, and in my own work, that's part of why I write dual POV. Is I want to be in my main male character's head half the time. So I totally hear you.
so that's interesting. Anyway, but back to the questions. This is something I've especially seen in middle grade writing, but I feel like one of the things that I often see mocked about some popular works, like even Harry Potter, is the things are too convenient for the main character. And I think this is probably mostly more so for middle grade, but I do also see it in like, maybe Akatar might have some of this. Um, but yeah, I was looking at that just a second ago. So what are some questions we can ask to make sure that we don't fall into this pitfall of making things too convenient?
Sure. So plot armor, as I've seen that called, or generally making things too easy or too lucky, can definitely be overused. And I think part of why that comes up most in middle grade and YA is because you the mo that's those are the genres where you have the most leeway to use that, where that is perhaps expected to some extent. And people will be given an inch and take a mile, so to speak. So let's see. The issue with this problem or this common complaint is has several different aspects that I'll try to go into here. So first, readers want to see how the protagonist is going to deal with naughty situations or hurdles or difficult situations. And the reader can feel cheated when those situations just keep getting dodged or just happen to work out. Second, we all know inherently that meaningful internal change often comes from adversity, so tension and conflict and overcoming hurdles. So, trying to force a character arc that's lacking meaningful tension and conflict can make that feel unearned, which we talked about earlier in this episode. Third, too much luck or convenience can make the author's choices too present or noticeable in the story. Like I'd given you feedback on in your story with your protagonist, it can feel like the author is sort of flinching away from actually bumping their characters up against anything meaningful. But along with goals, tension and conflict are the primary driving factors with many stories, most of them I would say. So too much luck and convenience can seriously hurt that momentum. So going off of that, I will give you a short list of questions that you can hopefully ask yourself to check if this is an issue in your work and hopefully fix it. So number one, at the global level, so looking at the full story together, where does your brain automatically go when you think about spots where things might be too convenient? And this is just a gut check, basically. So second, ask yourself the same questions about where do you just notice these issues at the sequence level. So that's any set of scenes that accomplish one thing at the act level, at the individual chapter level, whatever you want to do, and just jot these down. Make a list of where you think these things are happening. Then look at each moment that you have on your list here and ask yourself how badly that moment could possibly have gone within your established world building. So, for example, let's say that in the moment that you are looking at, your protagonist is shunned out of their village for something, but a kind passerby who just happens to be wandering by and sees them offers that this protagonist can come and live with them instead. Perhaps that the worst possible way that that could go instead when you're doing this brainstorming is that the protagonist gets caught in a storm outside overnight and dies in the cold from exposure, or perhaps the person whose home they end up going to is a serial killer or something awful like that. So now that you have these two extremes, you have too convenient and you have the story would end here. Um, now, like we have talked about before in connecting the dots in the character arc, what you want to do now is brainstorm 3 to, let's say, 10-ish, this is not important, levels of badness between too convenient and the story ends here that could, hit different levels so that you have option across a spectrum here, basically. So from that list of best to worst, then pick one that is both appropriate to your genre and your audience and fits the kind of story that you're writing and ideally won't require you to rewrite more of the story than you are willing to at that point. So, for example, in the same scenario that we were just talking about, perhaps the protagonist, instead of immediately getting into someone's perfectly nice guest bedroom, they have to wander alone for a day or two, getting dirty and hungry and sore before a gruff, not friendly passerby takes begrudging pity on them and puts them up in the barn rather than a fluffy bed in the house like you'd originally written. Basically, things don't have to go badly and stay bad to fix these too much convenience issues and luck issues, but replacing that convenience with just a little bit more desperation and need, and lessening that luck by degrees can do wonders for your reader investment and your momentum.
So, what are some ways we can be sure that the character growth arc doesn't appear to be formulaic? Like, I know, especially because a lot of fantasies writers follow the traditional hero's journey.
Well, first of all, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, formulaic isn't necessarily as bad of a thing as many authors seem to think, especially as a newer author and especially in genre fiction, those cliches and tropes and formulas are what makes it that genre, and people go looking for those specific genres and those specific subgenres because they want to consume more of that formula. The best metaphor that I found for this is just think about your favorite food. Like, let's say it's chicken quesadillas. Just because there's a certain formula that makes a dish a chicken quesadilla doesn't mean that you aren't potentially going to spend your entire life loving and repeatedly consuming chicken quesadillas because you like it, and that formula is why you like it. So thinking about that in fiction can be helpful and reassuring, hopefully. So moving on from that, I'll say that this is another reason you need to know your genre well, and to know when you are or aren't being formulaic, and ideally, if you really want to go deep with your research, what aspects are tropes or conventions or expectations of the genre and which are just overdone. This could be tricky, so again, don't overstress on this. But to answer the question specifically, so how do you avoid being formulaic? You do this by iteratively brainstorming. I've mentioned this process before, but it's a great skill to build in yourself for just about everything around self-editing. So you do this by you start writing down the first idea that you have, or in this case, if you're self-editing, the current aspect of a character arc that you're worried about being too formulaic. You just write that down. And then without putting in too much thought, this should be sort of a just get things flowing exercise. Bang out 10 to 50, however many you want to do, further ideas that might work. If one seems particularly awesome, if you write something, I'm like, oh, I'm so proud of that, then absolutely just keep, iterating on that and see how many different versions of that you can come up with until that juice runs out, and then go back to your basic list. Once you have that list, step away from it for a little bit, be that minutes or weeks or whatever time you think is going to be most helpful to you or fits the space that you have to work on this. And when you come back to it with slightly fresher eyes, pick a favorite and refine that until it works. So basically, the first ideas are almost always going to be more formulaic and unoriginal than the 10th or 34th ideas that you have, because that's your subconscious going, oh, well, I've seen this done before. I'll just slap that in there. But if you keep going down that chain, your own creativity and your own uniqueness is far more likely to come through. So just getting further down that brainstorming list often does the trick to get you out of that formulaic space.
So I know we need to wrap up here, but I did want to ask one last question. I know in my own book, it has a prophecy. How can we be sure that we show a character growth in our protagonist rather than just fulfilling some sort of destiny they have?
Let's see. So I think I'd suggest addressing this in one of two ways. So the first option is to have the prophecy be about who that character will become by the end, and then start their character arc at the beginning of the book as a version of themselves that still needs to change and grow and learn into that version that the prophecy is about. And then the second option there is to keep the prophecy vague enough that it doesn't constrict that character arc too much, or so that you can twist it. And this is general advice about using prophecies, as hopefully you've seen in movies and TVs and books over so many different examples. I have personally used prophecies in my own books, and I have had so much fun using like twist wording or homophonic names that sound like other words to keep my characters off balance about what those prophecies are going to be about and how they're going to come true, which prevents those characters from then consciously changing themselves to fit the expectations of this prophecy. So it's very much something that you can play with. So I would love to ask you at this point, having gone through all of your developmental feedback on this, like gone over in the bonus episode that I posted a couple of days ago, how are you feeling about your primary protagonist, so we'll say Amelia's, character arc across this first book?
That has actually been the biggest thing that I know that I struggle with, is because I know what I want her character arc to be. I'm just not sure I'm actually portraying it the way that I want it to be. So that's essentially where I am right now, is making sure that what my vision of her character arc is actually coming across. And I think for me, a lot of it was the point of view. I think that's probably the 95% of my problem right now.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that because we'll mention that in the podcast here of being inside a character's head is going to help a lot with delivering their arc.
Anyway, I just want to thank you so much for your insight. It has helped me so much. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Next week, we will go over what makes for a good antagonist, so the opposite of your protagonist here, or not necessarily a personified antagonist, but maybe a force of antagonism. We will go into the details around that, and how those need to connect with and contrast the protagonist arc. For now, I would really like to thank everyone following along with this Story Savvy series. You can really help us out by liking and subscribing to the Heartbound Editing Podcast and the Author's Alcove podcast, where you can find lots more content for fantasy authors and readers beyond this joint series.
I can't wait to chat with you again next week.